Hello. Well, this is a bit of the Mill at Sunnings podcast. I don't really understand a podcast, but Sally and Alvin asked if I'd read something or contribute something to the podcast. And I thought, well, yeah, I could do that. I could read an extract from a play, or because, of course, the problem now is that the mill can't be used because we have to distance, we have to lock down, we can't. Theatres are in huge trouble, and I would love to help in some way, and I hope that those of you who enjoy this podcast can maybe contribute something to the mill, because of course running costs don't stop just because audiences can't come. And Sally and Alvin and the mill have raised thousands of pounds for other worthwhile causes in the past, but now we're asking you to help raise money to keep the mill at Sunning going, and it's the most wonderful theatre. And what Sally's done is extraordinary. So I'm very happy to contribute in this way and give something, I hope, of interest. Now, I thought I wouldn't do a poem or whatever, but I thought, because it's the mill, because it's at Sunning, because it's on the Thames, and because for me the Thames has been a sort of lifeblood of my life, I thought I'd talk about that and about boats, and that might be more fun. So I was introduced to Henley when my parents split up when I was at the age of 15, and my dad very rightly bought my mother a house right on the river in the middle of Henley, a little Tudor house, I think it was, called the Old Granary. And it was across the road from Alf Parrott's boat hire and moorings. And my dad, bless him, bought me a little, I don't know what she was, I suppose about 15-foot plywood built motorboat with a cabin with 2 bunks in it and a loo and an outboard Evinrude which sat on the back. And at the age of 15, you can imagine, I didn't have my driving licence, so I couldn't travel, and yet it was very nice to have freedom. And so this little boat, which was moored opposite the house in Alf's mooring, was my lifeline to get away, to take friends. We'd go up river for long weekends, and it was a wonderful way to give me freedom at a time when emotionally I probably needed it. I remember one holiday with 3 school friends, and one of them was a keen fisherman, and it was a smallish boat, but he had his fishing line and his hooks and all of that, and bait. And it took up quite a lot of room, and we were away for, I don't know, 3-4 days, went upriver and camped on the edge, and some of us slept in the boat. And this fishing line and all of that used to really get me down, because I was always treading on it and getting hooks in my feet, and he never caught anything. And we came back to Henley on the last day, and we went down below the bridge and moored up down Fawley Way in a little, where the classic boat rally now is every year. We moored up there, and I noticed in the shallows a decent sized fish, and so I picked up a boat hook and I speared it, and I pulled it out, and I said to him, "Now this is all you need to catch a fish." And I think the point was made. Anyway, I grew up. I don't know how much I've grown up, but time went by, and my brother, who lived in Wallingford, like me, was a keen sailor. He was actually even keener than I was, and because we'd been born in the Isle of Wight, in Bembridge Harbour, on the edge of Bembridge Harbour, so we'd sailed since we were old enough to swim. And my brother was looking. He had two kids, and he was looking for a sailing boat for the river. And he was looking in Exchange and Mart, and he found this boat advertised. It was called a sailing punt, down in Twickenham, and it was advertised as being £50. So, well, that wasn't sort of what he was thinking about, but anyway, he was made curious by the ad, and he went down to Twickenham and he found it, pulled up on the bank, half in and half out of the mud, talked to the lady who owned it. Well, she didn't own it, her father owned it, but her father had just gone into a care home and was now too old to look after it. And so Chris, my brother, bought it for £50, and it had a pole, and it had, that was all really, and it had the mast, it had the sail, big bamboo mast about that round, and a gunter sail, which sort of gaff went up, and the sail sits a little bit forward of the mast at the front, and a boom, of course, and a rudder, a metal rudder, which dropped in through the stern deck, and lee boards in the side in the skin, so that when you put up the sail, the lee board stopped the boat going sideways and kept it going forwards, like a keel on a normal boat. Anyway, I was working in London at the time, and at weekends on Sundays I'd join him, and he slowly would get it up the river from Twickenham to where he lived in Wallingford, pumping out, bailing out a lot of the time because it had dried out and needed a lot of work. And he spent the next 4 or 5 years making it better and better and better, and we used it family picnics and whatever, out down the river. And I think the first trip I took then on it was going. No, she was built, by the way, because this is interesting. She was built by Harry Millam. Now, Harry Millam in 1893 bought a mudflat down in Strawberry Hill, and he built up. They were building the undergrounds in London, and there was a lot of clay coming out, and he took that, or bought that clay, or I don't know what, he just let them put it on this mudflat until it built up an island. It's now called Swan Island, and there's another boatyard there now. Has bought. I mean, I don't know when Harry Millam stopped, but I think the present boatyard started in about 1960. But Harry, in 1903, built this sailing punt. It's got the plaque on it, Harry Millam, Strawberry Hill, Twickenham, Middlesex. And of course, at that time, you know, there were lots of people suddenly moving into the middle class, suddenly having time and money for leisure. And the railways had come out of London. And so it was possible to, if you were doing quite nicely, to take the train out of London for the weekend and go out on your sailing punt or your canoe or your skiff. And in those days, because, you know, people were tired of the weekends, as we are, and they didn't want to row or pole or paddle necessarily all the time. And so they put masts and sails on their skiff or on their rowing skiff or their punt or their canoe. And you still see skiffs with masts, and sometimes canoes even with masts. But strangely enough, this sailing punt, the Bonnie Jean, as we called her, is a unique boat. There's no others like her. There's a model which somebody got made to get to advertise. A friend of mine has a museum in Shiplake of riverboats, and there's a model there of almost identical, the Bonnie Jean. But the Bonnie Jean is the only existing sailing punt, because of course they get swamped and they're not looked after, they dry out and sink. And so I remember my brother did one year we did a trip. I was working at Stratford-on-Avon, and we decided, my brother was living in Cambridge, and I'd had the punt on the Avon when I was there at the theatre. And I decided to deliver her over to Cambridge. And so over the summer, I think it took us about 100 hours, we went by water from Stratford to Cambridge, up the Stratford Canal, down the Grand Union through Braunston Junction onto that long bridge. I remember getting, not bridge, tunnel. I remember getting to the tunnel, and there it was. It's about, I think Braunston Tunnel's probably about half a mile long. So it was black, and we could hear these eerie noises coming out of it. And so we waited, a little bit nervous, and eventually we saw lights, and it was a canal boat being walked through, because your horses couldn't come through. There wasn't a towpath through the tunnel. The horses had to go over the hill. But the canal men, boatmen, were lying on the top of the cabin and walking along the roof with their feet, pushing their canal boat through. And once they arrived, we could see what these noises were, because they were laughing and singing and whatever. And then we went through, and that was an extraordinary journey, because it was all dripping, and it wasn't until you got about halfway that you could see the little pinpoint of light at the other end that you knew that you were going to get through somewhere. And then from there we went, I think it was the River Neme, and there's another river too, but eventually we got to Cambridge. Most extraordinary. We used to leave it at the end of the weekend, and we'd get someone to come and pick us up and drive us home. And then the following weekend we'd drive up and pick up the boat and continue on a really great trip, where one saw England through the back door, which is extraordinary, because, you know, houses, factories, if it's not countryside, if you're going through a conurbation, as they say, then you see everyone's back to their houses, back onto the river. And it was the most wonderful way of seeing England. Extraordinary aqueduct, I remember, on the Stratford Canal, which is sort of like it's almost like a roof gutter just across this valley. And you've got to have a head for heights, but we sailed across it, and we stopped in the middle, and I climbed down. There was a metal ladder, I don't know, about sort of 200 foot, down to the valley, and I went into the field and photographed up of this great aqueduct going across, and on the top you could see the sail and the mast of the punt going over. I still got it somewhere. I was going to look at some photographs for this, but I wasn't sure how well they'd show up. But another trip we made before that was we went down the Kennet, which is lovely, down the Thames until you get to the Kennet. You turn right and you go off down there. And later my brother, or maybe that's why I was taking it there, memory fails, but my brother discovered that there was a particular very good clay in this area in one of the tributaries of the Kennet. And he was quite interested in pit firing clay, which the Romans used to do. And so he built this underground pit, and he dug his clay from the same place, and then he covered it over and he fired up the pit. And having made these clay pots, he fired them and baked them, opened up the pit, loaded it into the punt, which was on the tributary nearby, took it down the tributary, then onto the Kennet, then up to the Thames and down. And I have a great photograph somewhere of him sailing past the Tower of London, where he was about to come into land, which is where they would have brought the pots to trade in London in sort of 1600 or wherever. So and I brought her down right from the very top of the river, as high as you can get. So she's covered the entire Thames, and of course been past Sunning many times. How did I get involved with Sunning? Well, because I've not played there. I mean, I've done a couple of fundraisers, I think, but I've not played there. But it's through Alvin, because Alvin directed Sinead in a wonderful film with Peter Sellers. Sinead's my wife. A wonderful film with Peter Sellers called Hoffman. And then in another Irish play called Shadow of a Gunman with Stephen Ray. And I made a little film, it was called The Liberty Tree for television, which Alvin directed. So he's been in our lives for a long while. Hence, when he married Sally and came to help her run the mill, that's my connection, apart from the fact that I punted past many times. We also, strange enough, we had, when I was working at Stratford, Charlie Rose used to, not Charlie Rose, what was his name? Somebody Rose. Charlie Rose is American, isn't he? But he ran the boat hire in Stratford. And I would sort of wander around. I'm always interested in what's inside things. And I discovered a sort of shed off the river, which, when I peered through the shutters, through the crack, I could see there were sort of canoes in there. So I said, Eddie Rose, that's right. I said to Eddie, what have you got in there? He said, oh, some old stuff. And so we went and had a look. And there was a canoe, beautiful Canadian canoe, mahogany, which had been rammed by some, when it was being hired, when all his canoes used to be wooden. And I said, what are you doing with that? And he said, well, I use it for moulds for the plastic ones that I now make and hire out. I said, well, you've got your mould now, haven't you? He said, I have, yeah. I said, well, can I buy that off you? So he sold it to me for next to nothing. And at that time, I had an old Derchevaux Citroen. And I put it, canoes fit rather well on the top of cars. I put it on the top of the Derchevaux and drove it over to my brother who lived in Cambridge and said, listen, it needs a bit of work. This is your sort of work. Will you do it up? And he did. And so it became, in a way, the tender to Bonnie Jean. Now, my brother then emigrated to Australia a little bit after that. And I said, what are you going to do with the boats? He said, well, I'd like to sort of sell my half in Bonnie Jean to you. And I said, great. And he said, I'm going to take the canoe with me. So he did. I said, I don't think it's a very good idea because Australia's very hot and dry. But he said, no, I want to for the kids and everything. So he took it over to Perth, where he moved to. And about 2 years later, he said, you know, this canoe doesn't work here. It's too hot. It dries out. I keep it in the garden and the sun just beats down on it. And when I put it in the water, the rivers are very rocky. And so it gets scraped and harmed. And so I think we should try and get it back. So at that time, my sister was married to a naval officer, Colin. And I said to Colin when I saw him, I said, you haven't got any ships calling into Perth, have you? He said, well, we have in about 4 months got, I think, an aircraft carrier calling in there. And I said, and then it'll eventually come back to England. He said, yes, it'll come back to Portsmouth. I don't know how long it'll take, 6 months or something, it'll potter back. I said, is there any chance you could bring a canoe back in it? And he said, I'm sure that's no problem. So about 4 months later, I went down to Portsmouth. They were expecting me, fortunately, so they let me on the aircraft carrier. And we went down into the helicopter hangars, and there, massive hangars, which at that time had no helicopters in them. I think it was there for a service, the ship. And there, hanging in the corner, about sort of 50 foot off the ground, was my canoe. And so we lowered it down and carried it off. I brought it home. Now, I've still got that canoe, and we use it. It's great for the kids. It's a fantastic boat. And it's the sort of tender for the Bonnie Jean, who, at the moment, is in the barn because I'm not sure what lockdown on the river means really, so I haven't put it in the river this year. Um, it holds wonderful memories. I remember when my children were small, we'd go off, Sinead and me and the two boys, and because not only is it a sailing punt, but it's also a camping punt. So you lower the mast down and strap it on the side, and then you put hoops up and put the cover over, and it's like this massive floating tent with room for 2 adults and 2 children easily, and we have a little stove. So it's fantastic for camping, and it is the most wonderful way to travel. I remember one evening, well, I remember many evenings, but one in particular where there was nothing on the river at all. We were just silently poling down the middle, somewhere near Abingdon, I think. And there was an extraordinary sunset happening. The sky was light and pink and extraordinary. And I suddenly heard the sound of an engine, and I looked back, and there was a hire boat coming up river. And I sort of pulled in because I didn't want to get in the way. And as they passed, I saw the man sitting driving it in the cockpit, watching the television as they charged along at 5 knots or whatever. And I thought, there's no connection. He hasn't connected to where he is. And the great thing about the punt is because you're down on water level and you're silent, you don't disturb the wildlife. You see it from its own perspective right down there on the water. And you silently go by without disturbing it, so that you see the bird life really in a wonderful way. And people think it must be hard work punting. Well, poling. Well, it's not. You get into a rhythm, and it's sort of like walking, really. It's the same, uses the same sort of energy as that. And if you get tired, you can drop a weight over a mooring and stop in the river and just slip off and have a swim, and then come and dry on the deck, and continue on. And there really is nothing quite like it. And strangely enough, the lockdown, I think, has reminded lots of us about the joy of having to be doing nothing, and of watching this extraordinary spring that we've just had from beginning to end. Hearing the bird life when they were all nesting in sort of early May, when the dawn chorus was second to none. And so punting really, for me, fulfilled what we've now been forced to do. It meant you had to travel slowly, you had to have a bit of exercise, and you could look and you could be part of the landscape. So it was, and is when I use it now, extraordinary. I don't use it as much maybe as I should, because I spend a lot of time in Ireland, where it's not suitable at all, and have a sea sailing boat there. But I try to get to the Henley Festival, the boat festival, which is an extraordinary long weekend. If you've never been, please go. You'll have the best time. Great food, great company, great stalls, great boats, and a tremendous atmosphere. So I try to get there, and I've just discovered the joy. For all my life, I've not wanted to put any sort of motor in it, because I think you have to earn your travel. But as time went by, I used to, if I had to travel long distances in it, I would hitch a lift and be towed by some boat that was going that way, and it used to give them a bit of a thrill and allowed me to sit there with whoever I was and make a cup of coffee and enjoy going at twice the speed we normally went. But I have a friend who has an electric motor which clips onto the side. And the joy of that is that you can, because with a sail, you can't tack very easily on the river unless the wind is in exactly the right quarter, for many reasons, because there are a lot of trees which buffet the wind around and don't keep it pure. And also, if you're going to go the way the wind will allow you, then you'll maybe travel 4 or 5 miles, stop and have a picnic, and then you've got to get home. And that means 4.5 miles into the wind when you've had a glass of wine and you'd really like to be home now. So the great thing about electric motor, you plug it on the side and it'll take you about 8 miles, and you just sit there and you can continue to drink and to talk and to enjoy what's passing as you gently go back home. So I'm afraid I've fallen into that. Maybe it's old age, but that has opened my horizons even further for certainly day trips. Anyway, enough of this. I hope it's been an interesting chat. Why, chats are good, aren't they, really? And I hope it'll make you want to think about the mill at Sunning and maybe send them a couple of quid, because expenses are still going on, and it is a place when lockdown finishes and we work out how with social distancing we can go back to the theatre. It's a place that will be welcoming you with open arms in the future. So for now, please keep it going. And thanks for listening. I hope it's been of some interest. God bless.